Alright guys, how's it going? This is going to be our video number 1 for Tuesday, March 24th. We covered pretty much all of Unit 1 period, the first period for APUSH yesterday, all the pre-Jamestown stuff. This is where things are going to get a little bit trickier. I'm going to read through the Princeton Review pages, but also I'm going to try to go through the key concepts that kind of overlap as best I can, but we're going to go through the pertinent information as best as possible. Okay. So, the English arrive. We're now picking up at PDF page 4 in the review reading for the 17th and 18th centuries. Alright, lost my page. Hang on a second. Alright, England's first attempt to settle North America came a year prior to its victory over Spain in 1587 when Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored a settlement at Roanoke Island that failed, as we know. By 1590, the colony disappeared, which is why it came to be known as the Lost Colony. The English did not try again until 1607 when they settled Jamestown. Jamestown was funded by a joint stock company, a group of investors who brought the right to establish the New World plantations from the king. How the monarchy came to sell the rights to land that it clearly did not own is just the kind of interesting question that this review will not be covering. Sorry, but this is not on the AP test. The company was called Virginia Company, that's the name of the joint stock company, named for Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen, from which the area around Jamestown took its name. The settlers, many of them English gentlemen, were ill-suited to many adjustments life in the New World required of them, and were much more interested in searching for gold than in planting crops. The only gold to be found in Virginia was iron pyrite, or fool's gold. Within 3 months, more than half of the original settlers were dead of starvation or disease, and Jamestown survived only because ships kept arriving from England with new colonists. Captain John Smith decreed that he who will not work shall not eat, and things improved for a time. But after Smith was injured in a gunpowder explosion and sailed back to England, the Indians of Powhatan Confederacy stopped supplying Jamestown with food. Things got so bad during the winter of 1609 and 1610 that it became known as the starving time. Nearly 90% of Jamestown's 500 residents perished, with some resorting to cannibalism. That's in the starving time. The survivors actually abandoned the colony, but before they could get more than just a few miles downriver, they ran to the English ship containing supplies and new settlers. That's when Governor de la Warr reappeared, or showed up for the first time, and told them to go back. One of the survivors, John Rolfe, was notable in 2 ways. First, he married Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, briefly easing the tension between the natives and the settlers. Second, he pioneered the practice of growing tobacco, which had long been cultivated by Native Americans as a cash crop to be exported back to England, which is what makes Jamestown and Virginia finally profitable. The English public was soon hooked, so to speak, and the success of tobacco considerably brightened prospects for English settlement in Virginia. Because the crop requires vast acreage and depletes the soil, and so requires farmers to constantly seek new fields and more land from Native Americans, the prominent role of tobacco in Virginia's economy was resulted in rapid expansion. The introduction of tobacco would also lead to the development of plantation slavery. As new settlements sprang up around Jamestown, the entire area came to be known as Chesapeake, named after the bay. That area today comprises Virginia and Maryland. Many who migrated to Chesapeake did so for financial reasons. Overpopulation in England had led to widespread famine, disease, and poverty. Chances for improving one's lot during these years were minimal. Thus, many were attracted to the New World by the opportunity provided by indentured servitude. In return for free passage, indentured servants typically promised 7 years of labor, after which they would receive their freedom. Throughout much of the 17th century, indentured servants, meaning the 1600s, indentured servants also received a small piece of property with their freedom, thus enabling them to survive and to vote. As in Europe, the right to vote was tied to ownership of property, and indentured servitude in America opened a path to land ownership that was not available to most working-class men and populace in Europe. However, indenture was extremely difficult, and nearly half of all indentured servants, most of whom were young, reasonably healthy men, did not survive their term of service. This is especially true from like 16 teens until like the 1650s or so. Still, indenture was common. More than 75% of the 130,000 Englishmen who migrated to Chesapeake during the 17th century were indentured servants. In 1618, the Virginia Company introduced the headright system as a means of attracting new settlers to the region and to address the labor shortage created by the emergence of tobacco farming, which required a large number of workers. A headright was a tract of land, usually about 50 acres, that was granted to colonists and potential settlers. Men already settled in Virginia were granted 2 headrights, totaling about 100 acres of land, while new settlers in Virginia were granted 1 headright. Wealthy investors could accumulate land by paying the passage of indentured servants and gaining a headright for each servant they sponsored. The headright system became the basis for an emerging aristocracy in colonial Virginia, where land was still the basis of wealth and political power, and was one of the factors that hindered the development of democracy in the region. Furthermore, it must be noted that these land grants infringed upon the rights of Native Americans, whose values regarding the environment and property ownership were vastly different from the values of Europeans who settled in the region. That's a key concept to be aware of, the differences between ideas of land ownership between Native Americans and English or Europeans. In 1619, Virginia established their House of Burgesses in which any property-holding white male could vote. All decisions made by the House of Burgesses, however, had to be approved by the Virginia Company. That year also marks the introduction of slavery to the English colonies. All right, French colonization. So we'll look at different versions of colonization here. Let's see. Hang on. Lost my place again. At first glance, the French colonization of North America appears to have much in common with Spanish and English colonization. While the English had founded a permanent settlement in Jamestown in 1607, the French colonized what is today Quebec City in 1608. Like the Spanish missionaries, the French Jesuit priests were trying to convert native peoples to Roman Catholicism, but were much more likely to spread diseases such as smallpox than to convert large numbers to Christianity. Like colonists from other European countries, the French were exploring as much land as they could, hoping to find natural resources like gold, as well as a shortcut to Asia, the Northwest Passage. Unlike the Spanish and English, however, the French colonists had a much lighter impact on the native peoples. Few French settlers came to North America, and those who did tended to be single men, some of whom intermarried with women native to the area. They also tended to stay on the move, especially if they were coureurs de bois, runners in the woods, who helped trade for the furs that became the rage in Europe. True, the French ultimately did play a significant role in the French-Indian War, surprise, and from 1754 to 1763. However, their chances of shaping their region, soon known as British North America, were slim from the outset and faded dramatically with the Edict of Nantes in 1598. The edict provided for religious toleration of the Huguenots, who might otherwise have fled their mother country just as Puritans had fled England. Okay, so real quick, it has a little quick summarization of all the major powers that ended up going to North America. First is Spain. Spain tended to conquer and enslave the native inhabitants of the regions that colonized. The Spanish also made great efforts to convert Native Americans to Catholicism. Spanish colonists were overwhelmingly male, and many had children with native women, leading to settlements populated largely by mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and Native American ancestry. France had significantly friendlier relations with indigenous tribes, tended to ally with them and adopt native practices. The French had little choice in this. French settlements were so sparsely populated that taking on the natives head-on would have been very risky. The Netherlands, or the Dutch. They attempted to build a great trading empire, and while it achieved great success elsewhere in the world, its settlements in the North American continent, which were essentially glorified trading posts, soon fell to the English, like whenever they took over New York. This doesn't mean they weren't unimportant. One of the Dutch settlements was New Amsterdam, later renamed New York City. And then finally you have the English. England differed significantly from the other three powers in that the other three all depended on Native Americans in different ways, as slave labor, as allies, or as trading partners. English colonies, by contrast, attempted to exclude Native Americans as much as possible. The English flooded to the New World in great numbers, with entire families arriving in many of the colonies rather than just young men. Intermixing between settlers and natives were rare. Instead, when English colonies grew to the point that conflict with nearby tribes became inevitable, the English launched wars of extermination. For instance, the Powhatan Confederacy was destroyed by the English Indian fighters by the 1640s. So, long story short here is that you have, a lot of differences between how they all settled. The English pushed away a lot of the natives, saw no reason to basically intermix or intermarry with them, unlike the other three groups who did a lot more of that, and that's a big difference there as well too. Okay, the next little bit, and I'm going to have to read a little bit about this into the next video as well, and we'll go at least into a little bit of the Massachusetts Pilgrims and everything else. All right, so for the Pilgrims, the Massachusetts Bay Company. During the 16th century, English Calvinists led a Protestant movement called Puritanism in England. Its name was derived from its adherents' desire to purify the Anglican Church of the Roman Catholic practices. English monarchs of the early 17th century persecuted the Puritans, and so the Puritans began to look for a new place to practice their faith. One Puritan group, called Separatists, because they thought the Church of England was so incapable of being reformed that they had to abandon it, left England around this time. First, they went to the Netherlands, but ultimately decided to start fresh in the New World. In 1620, they set sail for Virginia. But their ship, the Mayflower, went off course and they landed in modern-day Massachusetts. Because winter was approaching, they decided to settle where they had landed. This settlement was called Plymouth. So it's the first group, the Separatist Pilgrims that came in 1620. While on board, the travelers, called Pilgrims, signed an agreement establishing a body politic and basic legal system for their colony. That agreement, the Mayflower Compact, is important not only because it created legal authority and an assembly, but also because it asserted that the government's power derives from the consent of the governed and not from God, as some monarchists known as absolutists believed. Like the earlier settlers in Jamestown, the Pilgrims received life-saving assistance from local Native Americans. To the Pilgrims' great fortune, they had happened to land at the site of the Poxatuck village that had been wiped out by disease. One inhabitant of that village, a man named Tisquantium, better known as Squanto, had been spared this fate because he had been captured years before and brought to Europe as a slave. He wound up in London, where he learned English and then returned to his homeland only to find it depopulated. Shortly thereafter, the Pilgrims arrived, and Squanto became their interpreter and taught them how to best plant in their new home, and that